Rusty Workman cut the throats of this old man and his wife while out on a routine robbery. He says he doesn't know why.
I hope that they forgive me for what I've done. It wasn't meant to happen.
Horace Williams tortured a hitchhiker to death so brutally that the policeman who discovered the corpse couldn't make out whether the victim was black or white. Williams can't explain his violence.
I was like, man, I'm out of control. I'm out of control. I couldn't understand it.
Bobby Joe Long's catalogue of crime includes more than 50 rapes. He's committed at least 9 murders. Is evil the only explanation?
I know it sounds awful, especially after the things he's done, but I think Bob's sick.
The punishment must fit the crime. The only punishment warranted in this case is death.
Some would quarrel with the sentence, but most would agree on the verdict. These men are guilty of terrible crimes. But that doesn't answer the question, why? Science may now have an answer. Each has distinctive brain damage which fits his particular type of violent crime. Chemical or physical dysfunction may explain their violence. Can it excuse their guilt?
The violent offender is a complex jigsaw puzzle. What we are doing at the moment is identifying the pieces in the jigsaw puzzle. It's only when we can directly view and see the violent offender and see him for what he really is that we'll begin to develop sensible, benign treatment and intervention programs to stop violence in society.
The search for the roots of crime has been left to the social scientists. Yet poverty, neglect, abuse, poor education don't explain why most poor people aren't criminal, why the products of broken homes don't all go off and break the law. Today, new evidence from the science of biology may offer some of the answer, and may deliver some of the solution to a problem sociology has failed to diagnose or cure.
We assume in the law that everybody is born with enough sense to control their own behavior. On the other hand, we should realize that there are some people who are so impaired or so different in the way they control their own behavior that to hold them criminally responsible would be as though we were holding a 3-year-old child responsible for murder and we're deciding to inflict the death penalty on a 3-year-old child. The question is, where is the line to be drawn? And the biological state of an individual's brain is the really critical determiner.
It's long been understood that brain damage can result in extreme and violent behavior. Ted Bledsoe developed a disorder known as episodic dyscontrol. Suddenly, and without reason, he'd lash out in the course of a seizure. It was only by good fortune that he avoided actually killing anyone.
I was a precocious child in the sense that I was intelligent, highly intelligent, I think, and had a good imagination. I was energetic, and I did get into childhood trouble, childhood fights. I won a few, I lost a few, but I was not a violent person. I did not destroy things.
Ted was a brilliant school pupil and medical student. He qualified as a radiologist and set up his own practice in Washington, D.C. The practice prospered. But Ted was troubled by increasingly severe neurological problems.
It was getting to the point where if I became annoyed by anything, instead of dealing with annoyance, very quickly I was dealing with rage. And that rage expressed itself in violence.
The brain is a complex and multi-layered structure. The limbic system lies at its center. Here all our primitive innate emotions of love, hate and anger are generated. Governing these emotions is the cortex. This is the thinking, socialized part of the brain, which stops us acting on irrational or inappropriate impulses generated in the limbic system.
The rage attack is something that the individual cannot inhibit. The pressure cooker explodes and overrides all the inhibitory controls the individual might have at hand.
Episodic dyscontrol, or rage attack, is an electrical storm starting deep within the brain. The hurricane spreads through the limbic system and can't be held in check by the cortex. In Ted's case, the disorder was probably the result of a tumor which was later removed, but that didn't stop the rages.
There were episodes of violence against people which were particularly painful. One was against my former wife. And I slapped her, and she slapped me back. And I turned on her, and she was quite clear that I was enraged and that I was going to do her harm. Well, she picked up the phone and called the police, which enraged me even further. And I stalked her into the living room where I knocked her down, and I got on top of her, and I beat her with my fists. And I could have beaten her to death. Had I a weapon in my hands, I could have easily killed her. And all of a sudden, it was all over. And here I was with my wife lying on the floor, and I astraddle of her, panting because of the physical exertion of hitting her so many times.
Rage attacks tend to run their course, much like an epileptic fit. Once it's released, like an instinctual behavior pattern, it goes through its course and it ends when it ends. And it could end in 15 seconds or 30 minutes or maybe 2 hours. And afterwards the individual is exhausted and had no intentionality to rage out at someone, physically strike someone, or do what they did.
Something had changed, and I could not control the urge to destroy. The annoyance went from, oh, get away from me, leave me alone. It went from that immediately into, I want to kill you. Now, normally there are a number of stages between I'm annoyed at you and I want to kill you. But with me then, in the early 80s, those middle stages were gone, and I went from annoyance to I want to kill you immediately, just like that. And I had no control over it.
But there's a cure for Ted's rage attacks. An anticonvulsant drug suppresses the storm.
I knew that I was back. I knew that I had returned. I knew that the nightmare was over. I knew that it was going to be all right. I can't describe the feeling. It's like waking up from your worst nightmare and realizing that it was just a dream.
Ted's problem was simple to deal with once the disorder had been diagnosed. With Rusty Workman, it was a different story. He was born with a different brain disorder.
Both have been killed. We think that at this point that they were killed with a knife.
71-year-old Arthur Drake and his 63-year-old wife were found dead with their throats slashed Saturday night in Carlton's Food Center. Blood was spattered on the cabinets near the soda fountains at the back of the store where Arthur Drake's body was discovered. Later, the murder weapon, a razor-sharp fish filleting knife, was found on the roadside. This man, Rusty Workman, has confessed to the double murders.
The vast majority of crimes of violence that are committed, at least in this country, are impulsive in nature. And that people who bring an impulsive personality, an impulsive style to their general daily life functioning are the ones who most often commit acts of violent crime.
The job of the cortex is to harness and rein in the limbic system. When it fails, the impulses have free rein and are out of control.
Workman stated that he went directly to the man and cut his throat.
It wasn't intentional. I didn't go in that store to hurt anyone, or to do anyone, or to rob anything. I only went in that store for a cup and a beer.
Workman stated that he came around behind the counter, stabbed the woman, and then cut her throat.
The brain, unlike an automobile, doesn't spend most of its energy moving. It spends most of its energy stopping from going places it oughtn't to go. And so a brain that is generally under-aroused, and particularly under-aroused in those areas that impose self-control, simply doesn't put the brakes on enough.
Tell me about the short temper.
I've always had it, you know, ever since I was little. Most of the time, that's what got me in trouble, or the reason I tore something up, because I never had any patience.
An early indicator of trouble with the frontal cortex is attention deficit disorder, ADD, or hyperactivity. This can be the result of brain damage at birth.
When he was born, he didn't breathe properly. They had to breathe for him for at least a minute before he breathed on his own. The doctors later said that that could have caused some slight brain damage to cause the hyperactivity or the attention deficit syndrome.
His history, even in the early school years, was a history of not only not paying attention in class, but of committing impulsive acts which broke the rules and which were difficult to restrain him from.
A failure to concentrate often goes with impulsiveness in ADD children. The two symptoms result in disciplinary problems and poor performance. A self-reinforcing spiral develops of frustration, failure, and fury. Aggression becomes bullying, and bullying can set the pattern for a lifetime's violence.
What were you like at school?
A bully mostly. You know, I was pretty good. When I got up to like 7th, 8th grade, something like that, I was pretty good size.
Rusty was the firstborn. The family didn't realize how much he needed help.
We actually didn't know that there was any difference in him until our daughter was born. And she was quiet and sat and looked at books and played with toys for endless hours. And that never happened with Rusty. Nothing ever kept his attention that long.
There is a well-tried treatment for ADD. Ritalin is a stimulant which galvanizes the frontal cortex to govern the limbic impulses. Only when a child is in control of his brain can he begin to learn to master his more impulsive instincts.
He also was administered stimulant medications for a while to good effect. The regrettable thing was that someone who was misguided advised the parents that they should not administer stimulant medications because, in principle, medications shouldn't be given to children. And as a consequence of that, they withdrew those medications, which then led step by step to a pattern of misbehaviors later on that turned out to be quite regrettable.
One time I had a principal, he used to harass me a lot. Without even thinking, I had pinned him to the wall with his desk, had pushed his desk and him all the way to the wall and told him if he ever done it, I'd break his neck.
ADD children and adults very often seem to find some way to medicate themselves. For example, they consume tobacco in various forms more often than other children and adults. And nicotine has a well-known stimulant effect, which in this particular instance is beneficial in the sense that it reduces inattention and impulsivity.
While stimulants help those with ADD, depressant drugs have the opposite effect. The frontal cortex becomes even more neglectful of its responsibilities, and the limbic system runs riot.
Alcohol is a surprisingly devilish drug. Initially, seems to be a stimulant. The trouble with it is, it has its really more famous effect of depressing the central nervous system, reducing brain arousal, and generally further eroding such an individual's impulse control. So the devilment of it is that it comes across in its initial first aftermath of consuming it as a stimulant. And then it turns around like a snake and bites the individual with this de-arousal, which takes the brakes even further off and makes them even more deficient in self-control.
After the first time I got drunk, it got to the point where I liked it so much. And when I got drunk, you felt like you just couldn't be hurt, you couldn't be stopped. As a teenager, I drank every day.
Rusty had never received proper treatment for his ADD. Drinking depressed his control systems even further. One night, his impulsive actions ended in tragedy.
What do you remember in the convenience store?
Basically, it's so hard to explain. It's just, by that time, you know, it was like the point where you get so drunk, you're in and out. You're not completely passed out, but your mind's not registering what's going on. And there was some yelling, a scream. I heard the first scream, and after that, I can't explain it. I know it's just like something snapped. No apologies and no sorries could ever explain how bad I feel, or just how sorry I am for what I did.
The law has to be sure that a criminal knows the difference between right and wrong. The impulsive criminal does know the difference, but the jury in Rusty's case accepted that brain dysfunction could have played a part, and were merciful.
Unanimously recommended that the defendant, Rusty Workman, be sentenced to life.
So Rusty escaped death row. The tragedy is that Rusty would have escaped a life sentence, and Janet and Arthur Drake would have escaped with their lives if Rusty's medication had been maintained and his disorder monitored with techniques now available. Modern brain imaging techniques, like PET scans, give researchers a totally new vision of which parts of the brain are working and which are not. For the first time, we can see how the brains of impulsive killers like Rusty are different. The subject has to perform a task chosen because it needs activity from several regions of the brain. The scan shows scientists which areas are working normally.
The challenge task we used in this study is a task called the continuous performance task. You look at a computer screen, you see numbers flashing from 0 to 9 on the screen. You press a response button every time you see the figure 0. You do this for 32 minutes. It's a very boring task. It requires sustained attention. We've always known that it's the prefrontal region of the brain that's involved in sustaining attention. What the normal control is showing to the continuous performance task is widespread prefrontal activation. This is the prefrontal cortex, and this area here is the medial prefrontal cortex. That's what we expect from this task. Compare this scan of the normal individual to this scan of a murderer. This is somebody who was a single murderer. They only killed one person, and it was an impulsive one-off murder. The striking thing about this scan, and the exciting thing, I think, is that there's a distinct lack of prefrontal activation within this impulsive murderer. According to our theory, that's exactly what you would expect.
The impulsive murderer has prefrontal damage, and so does the hyperactive child. So, will every ADD child grow up to be impulsively violent?
ADD children, they have the potential, on the one hand, of becoming punk killers rather more commonly than non-ADD children do. They have a risk for disinhibited, impulsive, and rule-breaking behavior, even murder in the long run. At the same time, they have an equal risk of being the type of individual who thrives on high challenge. the same biological predispositions towards thrill-seeking, towards needing arousal and being able to arouse others to good cause exist in ADD children and should be nourished and cultivated. So I could wish that instead of shunning them and socially trying to avoid the problem, we would try to regain our own character as a people and engage our children in noble, strenuous, difficult, challenging, and exciting tasks. If we do, they'll build for us. If we don't, they'll destroy.